Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. Israel's longest-serving prime minister is about to be out of a job. For months, the country's opposition parties were squabbling over a possible power-sharing deal. But one thing they agreed on was that Benjamin Netanyahu had to go. Those replacing him will be a fragile coalition of the most unexpected partners. Israel's opposition parties that are set to take the reins of power include ultra-nationalists, the center-left, and for the first time, a political party that represents Palestinians in Israel. But even with the end of Netanyahu's 12 years in office, will the new Israeli government differ much from the Likud's hardline policies? The plight of Palestinians under Netanyahu was the most volatile in decades. Gaza bore the brunt of his military operations, including 3 separate campaigns that killed thousands, with the most recent being in May. There's also very little hope that illegal settlement building in the occupied territories will cease. With the ultra-right-wing Yamina party at the helm, Israel's continued encroachment on Palestinian land is expected to increase. And the ultimate question, can Israel's multi-faced government revive peace talks and bring about a final deal with Palestinians? And to break it all down, joining me from London is Asa Winstanley. He is an investigative journalist at the electronic Intifada. And from The Hague, Mouin Rabbani. He is the co-editor at Jadaliyya, an online magazine. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Asa, how has Bennett's decision to enter a coalition with the left and parties representing Palestinians reverberated among voters? I mean, was this expected of him? Did it come as a surprise, both for the voters as well as for Netanyahu?
Well, I think that the political terms of left and right don't really apply in Israel. I mean, what we really see is in Israeli elections, and every Israeli election, is a competition between the right, the far right, and the ultra right. And that's what we see with the incoming Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. I think, this is someone who set up a party called Jewish Home, really a Jewish supremacist party. The whole point of his old party was to represent the settlers in the West Bank. This is somebody who wants to carry out very similar policies to Benjamin Netanyahu. But in fact, there's just a matter of personal animosity between Netanyahu and his internal political rival.
So, Mouin, do you believe this coalition government can survive? And what are the challenges now lie ahead? And how is it going to be different than the Netanyahu government?
I think the short answer is that it's not going to be different. I fully agree with what Asa said. I think we need to remember that the only thing holding this very broad coalition together is a common desire to see Netanyahu removed for office, and the desire to see him removed primarily for personal rather than any policy or political reasons. So the question becomes, once Netanyahu is gone, what happens to this coalition? And I think the short answer, again, is that it's probably not going to last very long, because then it has to deal with all its various internal contradictions. Having said that, I think very much will depend on the fate of Netanyahu himself. If he manages to remain as the leader of the opposition, and in view of the razor-thin majority of the new government, he basically only has to ensure the defection of a single member of parliament from any of the 8 opposition parties for any reason in order to be able to successfully launch a vote of no confidence in the new government. If, on the other hand, Netanyahu is deposed as a leader of the Likud, well, then the only significant obstacle to a new coalition consisting of the Likud and the other more extreme right-wing parties in the current coalition becomes entirely possible. So one way or the other, I'd be very surprised if this new government has a long lifespan.
So, will Asa Netanyahu's departure do anything good for the Israeli politics, and how will it impact the daily lives of Palestinians moving forward?
Well, I think when you talk to Palestinians, they will tell you that it's irrelevant really who's in power in the Knesset. Um, all Israeli politicians are Zionist politicians. I mean, that's what this comes down to. They are the personal animosities and differences between them are all brushed aside when it comes to Israeli wars and the policy of the expulsion of the Palestinians and their replacement with Jewish settlers in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and the siege of Gaza. So I think that the policies are going to remain exactly the same, and that we're going to see more and more expulsion of Palestinians from neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. We're going to see more expulsions of Palestinians from the West Bank. We're going to see more killings of Palestinians in the West Bank. And this new so-called coalition government won't do anything to change any of that. So I think that the main point is that people in the West should be putting pressure on their governments to stop our government's support for Israeli policies like this, regardless of whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu in power or anyone else.
So, Mouin, do you agree? I mean, if the occupation of Palestinian lands do not cease under this coalition government, for example, where does this leave the United Arab List?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that the United Arab List entered into this coalition not because it had any significant political national demands that were met by these parties or the leaders of the new government, but it effectively put forward a series of what one might call municipal demands, which are fairly easy for the government to meet, but it's even in question whether those will be met. And my suspicion is that at the next election, the United Arab List will probably pay a significant price for having enabled this government. If I could just make one other point, while I agree with much of what's been said, I do think it's important to point out that Netanyahu has, having been in the prime ministry now for 12 years, is a very experienced leader with a very broad international network of relationships and contacts and so on. Bennett, by contrast, is a naive and inexperienced hard right ideologue. And therefore, and that's a big if foreign powers seek to exercise pressure on Israel in relation to its policies towards the Palestinians, they have, I think, a more significant opportunity to see results than they would under Netanyahu. That, I think, is the only real difference. But as far as the intentions and the policies of the new coalition are concerned, I would fully agree that one would be extremely hard-pressed to seek to find any significant difference.
So, Asa, how would relations under the new government look like with the, let's say, U.S., Turkey, and the Arab world? And do you believe that this government could have a coherent foreign policy?
Well, I think the relations with the U.S. government and Turkey and the Arab world, I mean, it's too soon to say, but I think that the participation of so-called left-wing groups in this coalition will be able to provide Western governments, certainly, with a kind of smokescreen where they can say that, well, perhaps this will be a more conducive government for us to work with. And you see that even from, supposedly left-wing politicians, that sort of rhetoric. People like Bernie Sanders said something very similar to that quite recently. But in reality, I agree with Mouin that the actual policies will be exactly the same or worse. I mean, look, you've got to look at Naftali Bennett's record. This is a hard right ideologue, settler ideologue, who, as long ago as 2013, put forward a plan to annex the whole of Area C of the West Bank, which is the vast majority of the West Bank. And then years later, Netanyahu puts forward, and in alliance with Trump, puts forward the so-called deal of the century, and the plan to annex almost all of the West Bank. So we see this dynamic in Israeli politics of the right and the far right and the ultra right trying to outflank each other. And even Israel's supposedly left-wing politicians like Isaac Herzog, who's just been elected by the Knesset as the next president, ceremonial head of state. Even he, as in the past, tried to outflank Netanyahu from the right with, racist rhetoric about infiltrators from Africa, and Netanyahu supposedly not doing enough to expel them from the country, and so forth. So, this is the kind of negative dynamic that we see in Israel, and it's the only kind of dynamic that we're ever going to be able to see in Israel, because at its root, it is a settler colonial society.
Yes, unfortunately. Mouin, how has Netanyahu's political choices of division and fear played out among political parties so far, and has it come to an end now?
No, it hasn't come to an end. I think one has to recognize that if there's one quality at which Netanyahu excels, it's incitement. This goes back to at least the 1990s, when Netanyahu was widely held responsible for setting the stage and establishing the context of extreme polarization and incitement, in which Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in 1995. And we've seen this in previous election campaigns, where he has openly incited against Palestinians in Israel, who, after all, are Israeli citizens. And the basis of the incitement was that, these people are going to the polls and exercising their right to vote. And what we've seen in recent weeks is Netanyahu taking that incitement up a further notch and denouncing the new coalition, very much like his good friend Trump in the United States.
Yes.
A left-wing government beholden to the Arabs, and so on and so forth. And I think it's important, in view of the growing right-wing polarization of Israeli society, to not just dismiss these slogans and this incitement as the workings of a power-hungry radical, but to recognize that these slogans have real resonance among a very significant and growing section of the Israeli electorate.
Yeah. Too many questions remain. We'll see if there's a risk of political violence as claimed by Israel's security service, or will we be seeing a peaceful democratic transition? So unfortunately, we'll have to wrap it up here. Thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk.